Hello, and welcome to the recording for Chapter 8, Inventories for the Methane Abatement Handbook. Today we are joined with a special guest, Deanna Haynes, who's the Senior Director at Honeywell. Deanna was also one of the contributing authors of the Methane Abatement Handbook. The handbook can be accessed at the website shown on the slide here. Deanna will get into details on Chapter 8, but we would encourage everyone to take a look at the handbook itself for more details. Again, a huge thanks to our funder for the handbook, the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources, for their support. And with that, Deanna, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Deanna Haynes. Thanks, Priya. So I'm going to first talk about inventories and some of the key takeaways around inventories. It's really important that the inventories that you develop provide insights into the relative magnitude of the different emitting sources so that you can properly prioritize where you want to develop policies to get the best reductions at the most cost-effective, in the most cost-effective way. So this provides you the different ways to develop those inventories. Typically, there are the most common way to get an inventory fairly quickly is using what's called an emission factor method, and I'll go into a little more depth about that. And but you could also use what are called measured informed data that takes data from like satellites or aerial surveys or other instruments to get more direct measurements of the emissions that are happening. Next slide. So in terms of monitoring, there has been a lot of assessment over large areas of different areas, and they have found that using like aerial surveys and things like that, there has been a fairly big difference between what they're seeing in the aerial surveys versus what's happening from bottom-up inventories. So depending on what type of sources are happening within your countries, you could have a variety of different sources, and it may be that you can use traditional emission factor, activity factor types methods to come up with the estimates of those emissions for the sources, but you may have to consider that there may be different types of sources that require different methods of measurement, things like that, to get a better assessment of that. Generally speaking, there are differences that are happening between aerial surveys and these bottom-up inventories. So the technologies to monitor will be different depending on the source, and you'll have to employ different methodologies to make sure that you have a good understanding of what those are. The bottom line is, though, it's pretty straightforward to come up with an emission inventory. The key thing is making sure that you have some confidence in that inventory through different measurement methods, and we'll talk about that. So the basic data that you need to compile in an inventory is, there are protocols today that have what are called emission factors times an activity factor. These are the basic ways of coming up with an inventory, and it's laid out in different EPA, for example, lays it out in different protocols. And what they do is they've made an assumption based on, let's say, the volume of gas consumed is correlated to how much emissions you're going to emit from that, or the miles of pipe that you have in a natural gas distribution system has an average leak rate per mile. So it's based on an emission factor that has some roots in a study that may have been done over a national or a large sample set, and it's averages typically, and they can be multiplied quickly by an activity factor to get you an emission inventory. The other methods are using actual measurements, whether it's continuous monitoring, fixed monitoring type systems, or aerial systems, things like that. Each of them have their pros and cons and their use cases. But the bottom line is that it's helpful to have a tiered approach or different methods of measurement to help you make sure that you can bound the information and get a sense of, where the upper bound is, where the lower bound is, and see whether or not the measurements are within uncertainty levels of the different technologies or measurement methods. To the right, there's just a graph of the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program that shows that they have kind of laid out over the United States where the emissions are coming from based on their inventory, and that can give you a good sense, if you could do that, a good sense of where your biggest sources are and where they're localized. So in terms of inventory of plugged and abandoned wells, there are efforts right now to figure out what those are. The amount of venting that could happen, the amount of releases that could happen from abandoned and plugged wells is something that needs to be managed, and there are some opportunities to help with financial assurance so that you can make sure that these wells have some type of ability, the operators of these wells have some type of ability to go back and manage them if something is happening. So there are some uh, ability to put in policies around the financial assurance to make sure that you have the ability to close these wells in a robust way and track the ownership of those wells so that if something does happen that they can later on go back and plug and cap them and basically make sure those wells are decommissioned without leakage. So in terms of design considerations for developing reporting programs and emission inventories, a well-designed program can help you manage these emissions and help you reduce and be through a really in a cost-effective manner, because you'll know where the largest emitters are versus the smallest emitters. It will really help you focus and prioritize those larger emitters to get the reductions you need quickly. So the key factors to consider around the scope of the reporting that you want the constituents to do, what specific methods that you want them to use, how transparent that data is, and any inclusion of additional data and third-party verification components. It's really important that you have an independent view of that data. And then, of course, factoring in the uncertainty of the data to make sure that you understand the bounding. So there's various technologies for monitoring, all the way up from satellite to lower elevations down to aerial, mobile monitoring, and fixed sensors. Again, all of these have different advantages and use cases. Generally speaking, satellites will cover large areas, but they may not be able to pinpoint and get down to where the actual sources are coming from. Aerial and mobile monitoring may be able to get a little better in terms of location of where the emissions are coming from, but their accuracy in terms of ability to understand how much is being emitted is maybe a little less than pinpointing via fixed sensors that are at the sites and can locate the emitting sources fairly easily, and then can also see some of the intermittent releases that could be a significant contribution to the inventory. So continuous fixed sensors versus snapshot type measurements from satellite and aerial or mobile systems. You'll probably want to look at a combination of all of these types of technologies in terms of your policies and how you go about measuring this, because each of them will have different advantages. Having some type of fixed sensing continuous monitoring is very helpful for catching those intermittent leaks or those releases that can contribute a large amount of emissions to the inventory. But if you want to get a good sense of large emitters quickly, so that you can help address those fairly quickly, satellites and aerial monitoring are also very good for that. The resources available are there's multiple resources, and this is just a good list. There's one that's not listed here, and that's the International Energy Agency, which has a lot of good a database that has some policies associated with it that you could refer to and can give you a good resources on the different emission methane inventories. They have the global methane tracker that is also good resources, but there are many resources out there to support and help you understand what type of programs are working, what are out there, and can help you get a good template to refer to. I think
Great.
that's it for the inventories.
Yes, thank you so much, Deanna. And again, please take a look at the handbook if you have further questions on anything that Deanna has covered in this chapter. And stay tuned for the next chapter, which is chapter 9 on monitoring, which was lightly touched in this recording, but will be the focus on the next recording.